Hey, welcome back to the Happy Cynics. This is Dr. K, along with the all-seeing eye dog. Hi, Isaac.
Hello.
Hey, how's everybody out there? We hope you're doing well. We're pressing ahead with the deprogramming project. And so today we're going to tackle a particular type of fundamentalism. That is fundamentalism dealing with text. So if we want to call this textual fundamentalism, something along those lines. But, and we're not just, well, at least I don't have in mind just exclusively religious text, although that typically is the biggest factor or type of people's strict adherence to text. But that could also include, just say literalists with regard to the Constitution. So anyway, let's make sure we're on the same page first here, Isaac. So you want to start by defining, like, how would you describe fundamentalism, or what does it mean to you? And I'll say what I think it means to me.
Well, so based on what you taught me, I've always kind of equated fundamentalism with like philosophical foundationalism.
Yes.
Where you start your thinking with a certain set of presuppositions. And those presuppositions are considered foundational to the entire horizon of knowledge, the entire like building of knowledge that you are working from. These are the foundations of it, and therefore they cannot ever be questioned. Right. So I think you see a lot of this in like biblical literalism, which is like basically Christian fundamentalism, where they say, right, well, the Bible is God's word and is God inspired, therefore it must be true. And the Bible says it's true, therefore it's true.
Yeah.
You can't, if you question that, then you've left the sphere of truth, and therefore it's not true. So that's foundationalism, and that's what I would equate with fundamentalism, regardless of what it is.
Yes. And I think we're on the same page, because I guess what we're dealing with here is not necessarily fundamentalism itself, but is one of the characteristics of fundamentalism that often appears, and that is, say, textual literalism. People who do not want there to be any room for interpretation on certain things. Now, yeah, so this ends up being part of Christian fundamentalism, and I would say Islamic and Jewish fundamentalism as well, because the Abrahamic faiths are all centered around texts that we believe are divinely inspired, or in the case of the Quran, actually dictated by God through Gabriel to the prophet. The thing is, we can even have, like, say, textual literalism when it comes to things like the U.S. Constitution, other kinds of statements. So where do we want to start? I mean, I can think of, like, why this is a problem. Maybe that's a good place to start. So
sure. The other place to start would be to talk about like the history of.
Oh, okay. That sounds good. Why don't we do that? You want to start us off there?
Sure. So I did some looking to find, like, where did textual literalism come from in the Christian tradition?
Right.
And it's actually, I had this like idea of like, oh, this is more of a modern idea. But I actually found there's significant debate amongst early church fathers about this.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly Augustine.
Yes.
I wouldn't call him an early church father. He's like a middle period church father.
Yeah. I consider him like the transitional from the patristics into the Middle Ages. Yes.
Yeah. Because he's post-Constantine, so he approaches the text from a very like every word in this must be true or all of it is false.
Right.
Whereas if you go earlier, there's more debate. There are some early church fathers who say, well, every word of the text is true for matters concerning faith. And there's others who say, well, whether the text is completely true or not is not really important. It's more about our relationship and interpretation of it.
Right.
So this debate has been going on for a very, very long time, but it really solidified in the last 2 centuries, particularly in America. So all the way through the Reformation, all the way through, this debate has been going on. Even Luther has this debate with himself about whether the text is all true or not.
Oh, exactly. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, he contradicts himself. Yeah. At one point he says, well, not every word of it is literally true and it doesn't really matter. And then later on he says, no, it's all true. And, if you doubt any part of it, then you doubt all of it.
Yeah.
So there's tension in the Christian faith in this, but then in the, what's the Great Awakening or whatever it was in America, the revival movements in America.
Right.
The term fundamentalists came to be, at that New York conference in Buffalo, I think it was.
Yes.
Was it Niagara? It was Niagara.
Yeah, it was. It was up Niagara. Yes. Yeah.
And that's what really solidified the every word in the Bible is literally true, and there are no contradictions at all in the Scripture. That position was solidified at that moment, and has continued to define this sort of split in American Christianity, with the fundamentalist side continually being the loudest and apparently more popular side.
Yes. Okay. So that kind of takes me into, so I'll just kind of, the only thing I'll add to what you said is, partly what gave rise to this is Christianity became very foundationalist. And so I think the same thing's true. For example, the difference, all right, so here's my understanding. Judaism developed a whole rabbinic tradition. So you first have the Torah, which was originally believed to have come all of it come from Moses, the Pentateuch. But of course, now scholars recognize that there are at least 4 main sources in the Pentateuch. The Yahwist, the Elohist, priestly source, and the Deuteronomistic source, right. JEDP. So you had the Torah, and then you had the prophets. So the prophets were speaking out and interpreting the law in the new context. Really, the prophets and their writings emerge in the period of exile. So this is where the context changed. There's no more temple. So what does that mean about the faith? So a lot of debate. Well, then that also gave rise to a broader rabbinic tradition. I mean, you not only had the other writings which were canonized in the Hebrew scriptures, but you end up with all these rabbis who end up producing the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud is pretty immense. But there's this whole tradition. And then you have the Jerusalem Talmud, and then you have the Mishnah, Midrash, etc. You have basically multi-layers. So you start with a set of text, and then there needs to be another set of text to interpret them, another set of text to interpret them, and so on and so on and so on. So you have these kind of concentric circles working their way out. So the Torah, the prophets, the other writings, then you have the Talmud, okay, the Mishnah, Midrash, etc. You have something similar later on. Okay, I'm leaving Christianity for last. Well, let's just take them chronologically. So the Christian writings are centered around the Gospels. So the Gospels, and for a long time, Christians, and I think a lot of versions of the New Testament still do this, put the words of Christ in red letters. So that's kind of indicating that those are core things. Even say in the other New Testament writings, like there's a couple places where St. Paul acknowledges, like when he's talking about divorce, he's like, well, this is what I think, but of course that's different than what Jesus said, what the Lord said. But anyway, he's not putting his opinion up there equal with Christ. Okay. So again, you have Gospels, and then you have epistles, and then you end up having the writings of the early church fathers, because you didn't really have this hardcore organization early on until after Constantine. So then after Constantine, you end up with all these councils which produce creeds, and then it just keeps going out from different theologians and traditions and the particular confessions of faith of the different groups. So
yeah, I think it's interesting in Christianity that like different parts of Christianity consider different parts of those as like different levels of authoritative. So like the Catholic Church would consider the creeds to be the most authoritative statement of faith. And then the words of the church fathers and the Pope are central, and then the Bible is almost secondary to all of those things.
Well, okay, it's interesting you should mention that, because that's exactly what happens, but it's because the Catholic Church's interpretation is that the inerrancy of revelation, God's revelation, is the church itself, not necessarily the text. The texts are a product of the church, and even though the biblical texts were written prior to the formal organization of the church, it's the church who sifted through all these dozens of books and picked out the ones that they decided were going to have authority. So I think rightfully so, that the Catholic Church says, hey, we're the ones that canonized the Bible. We're the ones that made the decision. The rest of you are using our Bible, at least a good part of it. Okay. Protestants are the ones who later on, because they did not want to see, like, so the Catholic Church's view developed, and Catholic fundamentalism has to do with not text per se, but the church itself. So you kind of counterbalance this, like strict adherence to text, by giving the Pope this supreme authority, or like when the Pope is speaking out of office, the Pope is infallible. So by the 1800s, this is kind of like the counter reaction to the Enlightenment. So in the mid-19th century is where the Catholic Church comes out with the Vatican I Council and the Pope's infallible, et cetera, et cetera. And so Catholic fundamentalism is, God won't let the church make a mistake. All right. Mm-hmm. Well, Protestants rejected that because Luther had all these complaints against the church, 95 of them to be specific. But the Protestants still wanted some type of foundationalism. So Catholic foundationalism, the foundation is the church, and the church never makes a mistake. The Protestant foundationalism end up being the Bible. So Protestants basically, I'm just going to be blunt here, ladies and gentlemen, Protestants basically propped up the Bible and gave it a level of authority that up to that point in time, it had not really had. And what I mean by that level of authority, it was always understood that the books that are used in the text were the ones that reflect the theology of the church fathers, to the extent that they believed that these books reflect the theology of the early apostles. I just came across, and even prepping for this episode, now there was some Bible college out in Oregon that had some kind of statement that the canonization of the Bible wasn't even really necessary because it's so obvious which books God inspired.
Yeah. Well, so that, I think that brings up an interesting point. It's like the history of how did these like collections become authoritative for specific communities, which is the process of canonization.
Right.
The Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible,
right,
wasn't canonized until 100 years into the Common Era.
Right. Right.
So the catalyst for that was the destruction of the temple
Right.
in 70 CE.
Right.
And that brought all these Jewish groups together to say, look, these are the core texts that are authoritative for our community. So the motivation for closing your scriptural canon is this like sort of persecution from the wider culture. It's that sense of, well, we are sort of disappearing. We are losing our faith. We're becoming less culturally relevant. So we need to specify and set in stone that these are our cultural heritage and nothing else can be added to this.
Yeah, now, I think that... Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, for Jewish people, they do add from the rabbis, right? You know, the Midrash, the Talmud.
Right.
Which are commentaries on the Tanakh.
Right.
And are where the discussion takes place. But nothing can be added or taken away from the Hebrew Bible. Now, 100 years after that, you have your first list of books that could go into a canon from... Was it Chrysostom? It was some early church father that I'm not recalling right now. And he lists all these books and he says, these are the books that I consider authoritative for Christian faith. But he never recommends that there be a closed canon, that nothing could ever be added. It's not until the year like 400 that the canon is closed. So that's 200 years after the first list appears.
I think the last one was around 419. So I'm thinking the councils of Carthage.
Yeah, and part of it was in response to the Marcionites. Right.
So, that's what I was going to say. I mean, Judaism, I think the closing the canon was a sense of preserving what they have. So basically, the destruction of the first temple is what initiated the writing of the text. Most of the texts were written in that...
in exile.
In the exilic period. And then after the temple's rebuilt, that things just keep kind of expanding, but then the canon gets closed after Nero's troops go in and level the temple in 70 AD. And now for Christians, I think it was more of the heresy thing because Christianity was much more diverse. And that's because Judaism and Islam were centered around two specific cultures, both claiming to be the direct descendants of Abraham, the Jews and the Arabs, Isaac and Ishmael. Christianity was basically an international, like very quickly an international movement or a global type movement. And so there wasn't really any unifying culture to keep it all together. And so Christianity started having big differences. And most of these groups became a part of the organized church, and the church basically nailed down the table, so to speak, so there wouldn't be any room for expanding. You still had groups like in Ethiopia, the Jews and the Christians in Ethiopia tend to include like the Book of Enoch in their canon, which that is so much in tune with Zoroastrianism. Christians didn't want that connection, although the Book of Enoch is mentioned in the Book of Jude, which did barely get canonized.
Yeah, it's interesting if you like go look at the books that are almost not in the canon. It's like the pastoral epistles, Jude and Revelation, are almost not there.
Yes,
there's quite fierce debates about those books.
Yeah,
because they're considered fakes.
Well, exactly.
By most of those church fathers, they say, well, the people who wrote these were probably not who's on the signature. Like Paul probably didn't write the pastoral epistles. John probably didn't write Revelation. And because they're fakes, that was the debate.
And I don't know, like, there's like in Christianity, and this ends up being part of the fundamentalism. They don't, okay, so without me going down too many rabbit holes here, I guess the part of the fundamentalism is to somehow preserve the text. Let's put it this way. People want to be able to just kind of go to the text, and maybe that's the direction I'll go here for a second. Why is fundamentalism so popular? I just think a lot of it is just intellectual laziness and a fear of diversity. And the reason I say that is because there are certain people that do not want things to be open to interpretation. They don't want there to be differences of opinion in the same society on certain issues, whether that's your country, your town, or your church, or wherever it may be. People think that everybody ought to agree on everything, or at least there's certain things. That's really what fundamentalism is. That's why the text part is tied to Christian fundamentalism, because the first fundamental is that the Bible's inerrant in every way.
Yeah, I think that it's not just like foundationalists or fundamentalists who feel that way. I think that's pretty universal, that everybody thinks that they're right about everything and everybody should agree with them. I think the way that fundamentalism operates is that it takes authority away from a figure of like a person, the person of God. It takes the authority away from that because that's not really concrete. That's very abstract, and puts that authority into a very concrete book, right? So it like deifies the book, right? So this is now equated with what God is. The Bible is God. We worship the Bible.
Well, see, I think really, I mean, here's the thing. I would say, and this is part of Luther's problem himself, okay? Martin Luther. I think that the fundamentalist tendencies of even the early reformers like Luther and Calvin and Knox and some of the others is actually contradictory to the whole spirit of Protestantism, which is the priesthood of all believers. Everybody answers to God directly, and everybody's going to be judged according to his or her own personal conscience. Now, see, if that's the case, then at some level, this is where the philosopher Kant was right, in the sense that everybody then has to become, so to speak, a legislator of morality. Like, you cannot really count somebody as being a moral person who basically just does what they're told. You are only a moral person is if you are acting according to what you are convinced is the right thing to do. Now, in order for that to work, there has to be a fair amount of tolerance amongst people of saying, well, we're going to disagree on what God might want in this situation, if I'm going to frame this in Christian religious terms.
Yeah, I think looking at like the Reformation, I think it's important to be fair. Luther and Calvin, who you'd like say, like based on how their churches are expressed today, are fundamentalists. But Calvin wasn't a fundamentalist, and Luther repeatedly says the Bible's authority should never be placed against the authority of Christ. So I would be careful about assigning those two figures fundamentalism, because they're pretty clear on it. But I think they are fundamentalist in their own authority. They're so convinced of that they're right that they're willing to impose that on everybody.
Well, here's the thing. I don't think that Calvin's a guy who just kind of like tries to proof text everything. I don't read him that way, and I think that'd be unfair to characterize him that way. I do think that Luther tend to see everything as black and white, and so Luther was, okay, this is the way it is, you disagree, you're wrong. I kind of read him that way, and that may be
I just think he's fundamentalist about what he sees as the characteristics of God.
Well, yeah.
Basically, Luther is right about everything, but if the Bible can be wrong, though.
But what I'm saying is this: they want it to say on one hand, well, you're not accountable to the church; we're directly accountable to God. But then basically, what they're actually doing by saying, "Oh no, the Bible is so perfect when it was inspired." It's like the biblical authors are superfluous. It wouldn't have mattered who the biblical authors were. The words of God appeared on the page. They were like secretaries and just wrote down what God said. And
right.
Calvin said the same kind of thing, that it was like the canonization of the Bible was just kind of superfluous, because it's pretty obvious which books. I mean, that thing I was laughing about, that Bible college. I mean, Calvin, I've read passages where he says things that are very similar to that. And here's the thing. When you go that route, basically you're saying everybody answers to God directly. Oh no, except for the biblical authors. You answer to the biblical authors directly.
Right.
See, and that's what people don't think about. It's like you say, well, who do I answer to, God, or do I answer to St. Paul? Now, I know this is probably going to rub some people the wrong way, but here again, I'll give you an example. I had a student. I may have already told this on the air before, I'm not sure. But I had a student a while back, and I was talking about, okay, how does evolution impact theology in terms of, creation and, say, sin in the world and Jesus being the second Adam and things like that? How's it impacted? Well, after class, a couple students, they wanted to know, what was it convinced me, because I used to be young earth creationist and I would not accept evolution for a number of years. And I didn't really start considering evolution seriously until I was in my 30s. Well, then this student said, what made you decide to trust the scientists more than God? And
right. Oh, yeah.
I think I told you that.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. The Bible is not God, and the book of Genesis is not God. I mean, God inspired it, and we can believe that, but it's like they're still people. That to me is the problem of, say, textual fundamentalism. It is it's really equating it's not acknowledging the human element. It'd be like if I said, Isaac, I had a bad dream. I had a dream about you last night, and I think God was trying to tell me to tell you. Well, look at it this way. Basically what people are doing is just saying, well, hey, if God revealed it to you and told you that, well, then I better take it at face value. Thank you for sharing that. But most of us would say, okay, the other extreme might be, it was just a dream. Okay, I'm not saying that's an extreme, but I'm just saying the opposite reaction might be to say,
I actually have.
It's just a dream and there's nothing to it. But maybe at some point, it's just like you go to church and you hear a sermon. Okay, I ask students, when you listen to a sermon, so like even if you're going to a mosque and listen to the imam speak, if you're a Shiite, okay, do you take those words as coming directly, like is the pastor, the priest, the imam, whoever's speaking, basically just speaking God's words directly, or are we getting this filtered through, like, even if you believe God is speaking through somebody else, it's still coming through their words, their ideas.
Right. I had a funny experience with this when I was in college. I was dating a girl for 2 weeks. Maybe.
Okay.
Not very long.
All right.
And she pulled me aside and she was like, hey, we have to have a really serious conversation. I was like, oh, okay. And I was not that invested in this at this point, so I was a little bit concerned that this was going to be like a very serious, like, oh, I'm in love with you and I think we should. And I was like, oh,
Get married.
No, I'm not there. And she came to me and she said, I was talking to God and Jesus didn't tell me that we should be dating.
Oh my
So we
goodness.
should break up. Now, a quick note. It's not that Jesus said, you should break up with that boy. It's that Jesus didn't say that we should keep dating.
Right.
Which is a whole new level of just
I mean
craziness.
Expecting a revelation. And that really illustrates something that I was going to come to. Why is it that people refuse to acknowledge the human element of these texts? It's because they don't want to have to accept the responsibility for making these kinds of decisions themselves. It just reminds me of, I use the illustration, say the kid in elementary school, when I was, like in gym class, the gym period, I remember once in a while they did like one time they did a little unit on square dancing because, back where I was from, there was a lot of places, people did square dancing and stuff. Well, and it's a little bit of exercise. Well, let's say there's a kid who doesn't want to do square dancing because he thinks it's corny and it's, it's too hickish or whatever. But he goes back home and then talking to his parents and say, well, our church doesn't believe in dancing anyway. So anyway, the kid goes back to school and says, oh, sorry, I can't do square dancing because it's against my religion. And the whole thing is the kid wants to get out of square dancing, and this just becomes a convenient excuse to do that. I hate to say that, but the reason I'm saying that is a lot of people, whenever something comes down to really costing them something, then they'll step back from their fundamentalism and say, oh, well, I don't know that God really wants us to have to do that today, whenever it benefits them. But when it's affecting somebody else and somebody else's family, oh no, you can't veer from what God says in his word. And basically, it's just like, I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to have to make any kind of judgment about it. And usually we're talking about things. When do people get out, and start thumping their Bible or their Quran or their Tanakh or whatever? It really has to do with issues that really can't be justified on some practical level. Right. And they're just uncomfortable with it. And this becomes a convenient excuse to say, oh, no, you can't do it because ancient people didn't think it was okay.
Yeah, I think you see the fundamentalist tendency, even in like especially charismatic congregations, because even if it's not textual fundamentalism, there's still a lot of, well, I really wanted this thing and God told me I should have it. Or, it's a lot of interpreting your subconscious desires as God's will for you. Right. I see that all the time. People say, well, God spoke to me, or I had a feeling that this is what God wanted. And it's really just you're just talking to yourself through this like role play character of God that exists in your brain. And that's as much fundamentalism, I think, as textual fundamentalism, where fundamentalism has to be selective in scriptural passages that it chooses, because the Bible is self-contradictory. It's difficult to interpret. It's, there's all these like levels of scholarship that you have to go through to really get to the core of the scriptures. But if you just pick a verse out and say, well, God said this, and that enforces what you subconsciously really want in the world, well, that's very convenient for you.
Yeah. Yes. you know, a lot of this, I think, comes about as society keeps adapting and changing. I would say in certain ways developing, perhaps. Well, certain number of people don't like these changes. Okay. I think a lot of this has been, and we've talked about this before, I think with now the advent of the internet and social media, the rate of change has increased so exponentially. Like, these changes used to take generations to take place. You'd have to wait for probably 2 generations to pass away before there could be, say, any kind of significant change. For example, I would imagine if there were internet starting, okay, I imagine if there were internet whenever the United States was founded, okay, in the 1700s, and people could communicate at the speed which they communicate today, I venture to say it wouldn't have been that far into the 1800s that women would have had the right to vote. And the issue of slavery would have been hammered out long before the 1860s. But see, it took generations of people being willing to even consider changing the status quo. And this is part of the sad part about it. There's a certain number of people that if they really wanted to adapt and think and grow and learn and develop, they could. But it's just easier just to kind of accept the status quo and say, this is what my text says. So, hey, it's just like you don't have, let's put it this way. The text kind of takes you off the hook that you have to look for ways to improve society because the blueprint's already there. If things aren't happening well in society, well, then you just write it off and say that's because there aren't enough people following our religion. Or if they're following it, they're not following as devoutly as I do. Obviously, if everybody followed their religion literally, then yeah, there'd be more unity. But what's the cost of that? The cost of that is growth and change and individuality and allowing people to live by their own conscience.
Yeah, I suppose it's easy to consider climate change is not important when you feel like, well, everything is just going to be taken care of by the deity at the end of the day.
Right.
So I don't really have to worry about this. I don't have to make changes now. We don't have to change our entire energy structure now because it's just not important to our religion. So who cares?
Yeah. And that is an interesting contrast, I think. So, for example, a lot of the same people who are resistant. So let me just do a contrast real quickly here. So take like 3 big issues in the United States. Okay. We've already mentioned 2. Climate change. Second one, of course, LGBTQ, human sexuality. And what was the third one? I was just thinking about it here a minute ago. Oh, abortion. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, abortion, okay, that one's a little more philosophical. And that one does hit people at different levels because of even birth control and abortion being necessary for more than just getting rid of a inconvenient pregnancy. Okay.
Right.
I'm not really that sympathetic with people. It's just like, oh, I don't want to have to use any contraception because I just like the feeling of it better and I'll instead abort the baby if we end up conceiving a child. I'm not a supporter of that. Okay. But there are a lot of cases where it's out of a person's control or there's going to be problems with the baby. The baby may end up having a really bad life. So anyway, there's a number of things to be considered there, but that one tends to kind of weigh down on different people in different ways, because that one ends up being a little more, I think, philosophical and also practical at the same time. But then you take the other two. All right. Well, like in the United States, okay, in the Bible talks about human sexuality, but it doesn't say anything about climate change. That's doesn't even show up on the radar. And yet, truthfully, Jesus doesn't even say anything about human sexuality in that regard. Paul does. Okay. Here's the thing. I just find it interesting how the people who are opposed both to, say, same-sex relationships and opposed to addressing climate change, but they don't, you're finding on climate change, they don't feel like, they don't have that textual foundation that they can thump everybody else over the head with it and say, we should be able to burn fossil fuels as long as we want. It's just a good thing there's not a verse in the Bible that says how wonderful it is to burn fossils or fossil fuels.
I did see an Answers in Genesis video about why burning fossil fuels is good for Christians.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not kidding.
What was the reason?
Reason is a strong word.
What's the rationale?
A lot of reason. The rationale was that God had given us domain over the entire earth, and therefore we should be able to burn fossil fuels freely.
Oh, really?
But also we should use solar and nuclear and wind and hydroelectric. And their concluding point was we need to be using all of these fuel types, all for the glory of God. As long as it's for the glory of God, it doesn't matter how many fossil fuels you burn.
Okay. You might as well say, it's okay because we have dominion over the earth. Like, if that's your theology, that it's okay for humans to torture animals and such. I'll let them alone. But most people, okay, they'd be the exception. So you did identify some, but most of the people, it's just like, well, it's not that bad. You won't hear them say, no, it's wrong for us to convert to solar power and have electric cars. They won't say that because they don't have any basis for asserting that. Instead, they got to argue, well, it's going to cost too much jobs. We won't be able to afford it. And it isn't that and the other. And it's right. Really, it's funny because you can see more, let's put it this way, it exposes more readily how a lot of this is just like, I don't want to think about having to change. The thing is, on the other hand, okay, the people who have somebody close to them in the LGBT community that they love and care about. Now, there's some people that care about more about being right or their own religion than their kids or siblings or whatever. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, most of the people I encounter do care about the people close to them. And so, but everybody else doesn't affect me. So, can't do this. Okay, well, gee, we love you, but you have to be celibate the rest of your life if that's the position. Well, that's easy to put on somebody else's kids. It's a lot more difficult to put that on your own kids. Okay, if it's somebody you know and love. The point is, I'm convinced that in both cases, for both issues, it really comes down to just people not wanting to change. And the text just gives people an excuse. That's why when they say they're going to follow the text literally, they do that, but only selectively. So some of the people who are out there saying about, for example, I just find it hypocritical to say LGBTQ people have to be celibate. Like if you're claiming that the Bible's inerrant, okay, right. If LGBTQ people have to be celibate, then don't put women up in front. Now, there are like Southern Baptists and that'll try to do both. But again, what about wearing costly jewelry, braiding your hair, whatever else it may be, tattoos, I don't know, rounding the corners of your beard. Would all Christians walk around looking like Orthodox Jews? It's just hypocritical. It's hypocritical.
I think from the outside.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's pretty obvious that it's wish fulfillment.
Yeah.
When you're not thinking like that, but when you are in that world, it's hard to see that in yourself because you've been conditioned, right?
Right.
To read the text in a particular way. And some things belong in a historical context and some things belong in the modern world and some things were meant for perpetuity. But one of the things that I think like kind of broke me out of this mindset was realizing like even the biblical authors weren't writing to be relevant for thousands and thousands of years.
Right.
Right. Paul is writing to specific people, and he doesn't think that people are going to be reading this in 100 years.
Right.
He's not. That's not even in his intention.
Right.
And he says that, like, I'm not Christ. This is my opinion. And so take it with a grain of salt, and obviously follow your own conscience. He repeatedly affirms that the ultimate arbiter of this is your own conscience, which is liberated in Christ.
This is where
that's where people I think depart from Paul. They say, well, no, this isn't a matter of conscience. It's written in the Bible.
And it's
like the most anti-Pauline thing I've ever heard.
Well, yes, I agree. And I think, honestly, that's why, okay, let me say this. There's a difference between here, Judaism and Christianity, and Islam on this particular point. Islam, I feel sorry, honestly, I feel sorry for Muslim people who have to wrestle with this because Muhammad basically laid it out. I'm God's true and final prophet, and I'm giving you God's words directly. Well, now you either have to take it literally, or you say it's Muhammad's ideas. Maybe you reinterpret it and say, okay, well then at least he may have been wrong to think it was God's words, but maybe those words are open to interpretation or something of that sort. That might be the question. Maybe that's where the wiggle room is. But what I want to say is there's not that much wiggle room in Islam. And I think that's why other religions are afraid of it. Because people that are raised in that faith, there's not a lot of room to say, gee, do we have to do all this stuff literally? Or can we kind of step back, just like women with the head coverings and different things like that?
Yeah, even like Christian fundamentalists will say, well, it's not, the translations aren't authoritative. It's the original.
Yeah. Original autographs.
The original autographs are the only authoritative text, which we have none of.
Right.
But Islam, I mean, if you're Islamic, you generally learn Arabic, and it is preserved in the original language.
Well, so that's what I'm saying. The Quran claims to be God's words literally. The Bible doesn't even claim that for itself, and neither does anything in the Tanakh. The only thing in the Tanakh, like in the Torah, is the law that comes from Moses, that God gives Moses on the mountain. Other than that, the stating of the law there in Exodus and Leviticus, the rest of it is God speaking through people, so you're getting people's words. Okay? And the Christian Bible doesn't even claim that itself is inerrant. It just says all scripture is given by inspiration of God. Now, where does that say that the Bible doesn't make mistakes historically, or the biblical authors didn't make any mistakes historically or scientifically or anything? It doesn't even say that for itself. These beliefs are made up human beliefs. I mean, even if you believe that the text reflects God's thoughts or words or concepts, whatever, it's not even claiming that it's doing that. People are giving the Bible a level of harsh authority that it doesn't even claim for itself. And they don't see the hypocrisy of that. They don't see, honestly, I mean, I'm going to be a little bold here. I think that is even pretty arrogant. I mean, who
that's why I was trying
knows,
to say,
who really knows the divine to that extent to know what God did or didn't say, honestly.
Right. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at with mentioning, like, oh, you've deified the Bible. You've replaced God, essentially.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting, like, it's good to keep in mind, at least for me, that, like, the fundamentalist tendency is a reaction against the perceived loss of relevance.
Right.
Right.
Yes,
and
I agree.
So if you want to get out of that, you got to address that in some way. And I think maybe we're getting a little bit long in the teeth. We got a little bit more time, but maybe we'll do a second episode on how to have a healthy relationship with authoritative texts.
Yeah, we probably not going to have enough time in this episode to do that, but
this will be a part 1.
Yeah, let's do that. I think that would be a wise thing, because I think it would be good to then start talking about what is a good way to approach these texts, and a reasonable way of putting these texts into proper perspective. The thing is, and I'll just kind of say this much, the issue, though, friends, is you can't, at the end of the day, you can't hide behind your religion or your text, because everything's open to interpretation. And even if you say it has to be taken literally, that's your interpretation. That is your interpretation. And you're responsible for that interpretation. You don't hide behind some text or some prophet or somebody else and say you don't have a responsibility for how you treat other people and how you respond to the needs of others. That is absolutely each human being's responsibility to at least try to get along with one another and try to improve life for all of us. So, yes, I'm getting a little bit preachy here
well,
today.
I think that's true, whether you're mistreating someone or doing good deeds
exactly
out of the same text.
Right.
Whether it's good or bad, I think it's imperative and crucial, I think, especially to the Christian faith, that is your free, conscious action.
Right. See, this is one of the advantages of the Eastern religions, because Eastern religions were created more by sages, not so much by prophets. See, sages, now the Hebrew Bible has wisdom literature in it, so you have some sages speaking into things. Christian scriptures don't have books that are about, because sages are talking about practical wisdom and principles that apply to everybody. A prophet basically has carte blanche. This is what God says, and you can go any direction you want to with that. When you anchor something down as practical wisdom, that can be tested. Okay, you can read Confucius, or you can read Lao Tzu, or any of the other great masters of Eastern religions, and you can say, yeah, this is still applicable today, or okay, well, that makes sense then, maybe not quite so much now. Okay, but that's such a more freeing thing whenever people can get past basically serving their text. People think that they're serving God by serving a text. But God is not the text. I've said that before. So anyway, I think that's a good idea. Why don't we do part 2, and then we'll come back and put together how can we approach these texts and glean from them today and appreciate them, and still not necessarily have to give up our particular religious beliefs, but still allow this to grow and develop so that over time religions become more harmonious instead of the fear of everybody ending up in a global showdown at Armageddon or something like that.
Yeah, I think it would be good for especially the American church to introduce a little bit more of the tension that the ancient church had.
Yeah. Yes.
The church fathers were all of one faith, but they certainly disagreed.
Well, sure.
On what the text meant.
Absolutely. It's just like Origen versus Tertullian.
Right, exactly.
Like, what's the role of philosophy? Does it have to be followed literally or not? And yeah, so it represents a good tension. And here's the thing, that's the advantage, true, also. And I'm sorry, my Muslim friends, but there is an advantage to having a text that has multiple sources. Because you're getting multiple viewpoints, and then those can be held in tension against each other. It's kind of a crying shame whenever I see conservative Christians, especially from the more Calvinistic Reformed traditions, who basically artificially try to resolve text or tensions that are already in the text, reflecting different viewpoints on the same thing. So, for example, like you have two creation narratives. They try to pick words in translation to try to make it sound like it's all one story and it all fits together really well.
Right.
There's two accounts of how David got his foot in the door to become the successor to Saul. Was he the boy who killed Goliath and then became a military leader, or was he a harp player who became best friends with Saul's son? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll try to gloss those together as though they're just one story. The same thing with the two accounts of Jesus' birth. They couldn't have both happened historically. We know that. The two settings are at least 13 years apart, when Herod was king and when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Those things were at least 13 years apart. They couldn't have both happened. Unless, the second one happened when Jesus was 13. I don't know. But the point is, people they lose a lot of actually value in the text because the people who canonize the text realized that they're
historical.
The people who canonized the text realized that they're getting multiple viewpoints, but they felt that they were all it was good for everybody to get both sides or different sides of the same thing.
Yeah, they're both meaningful in their own way.
Yes.
Even if they're both not literally true.
Exactly. So you read the book, like if you're a Christian, you read the book of Romans, Paul says, you're justified by faith and works has nothing to do with it. In fact, Paul's writings, works gets in the way. Paul's reacting against his Pharisaical background. And he wants to be done of all that legalism. On the other hand, James says, oh no, you can't throw works away because that's your proof of your faith. And so faith without works is dead. So which is it? Well, there's supposed to be a tension between the two. And that's evidently what the church fathers who canonized those books believed. If they felt strongly one way or the other, they would have rejected the other book from the canon. Because Martin Luther, wanted to get rid of the book of James. When the Protestants dropped the apocryphal books, the ones that were originally the part of the Greek Septuagint that weren't written in Hebrew, Luther said the book of James is a book of straw. We got to get rid of it. Fortunately, nobody got on board with him for that.
Right. Yeah. The tendency is to collapse ambiguity down into, uniformity.
Right.
Do you have maybe to close this out, do you have a favorite Bible contradiction?
Oh, contradiction? Contradiction or tension?
Contradiction.
Oh, contradiction. Do you have one?
Yeah, I'll go. I'll share mine. It's the there are two accounts of Goliath's death. one lists David and one lists a completely unmentioned character in any other part of the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
And I forget what the name is, but that's one that gets buried so deep into some, like, I think it's in Chronicles or something, where the second name of who killed Goliath is mentioned. That, like, most people don't even realize that this is a contradiction of the whole David story.
Yes.
And that's why it's my favorite, because people are like, wait, maybe the David and Goliath story is political propaganda to support the Davidic kingship. This is a different story that just had David's name slapped on it. Because that's what that suggests to most, biblical scholars.
I can't say that I have a favorite contradiction. There's a particular mistake that I find kind of humorous, and that is it's early in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew bends over backwards to try to make Jesus fulfill all the messianic prophecies.
Right.
Well, at one point, I can't remember which one it was, he quotes one of the prophets. Well, he's quoting the wrong prophet.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember if it was Hosea, or
he misidentifies Zechariah with
Micah or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So it's like he's quoting the wrong book. Like he just forgets where it's at. And that one I find kind of humorous, but yeah, it's kind of inconsequential.
That introduces a whole nother thing of, like, the New Testament authors, what they're calling, like, oh, these are the scriptures that must be fulfilled that, we hold sacred. They're referring to the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint.
Yes.
Which we have, and most Hebrew Bible scholars consider fairly inaccurate in its interpretation, in its translation of the Hebrew.
Yes.
So even, like, the New Testament authors are working with, like, not
the best translation of the Hebrew scriptures.
Most accurate translation.
Yes. Yeah, that was interesting. And and the Catholic Church kind of made the same mistake, relying on Jerome's Vulgate for all those centuries. Mm-hmm. I think it's only been in the last several decades that they've done a fresh translation from the original Greek and Hebrew. I have to look into that. But
the other thing to consider is Jesus didn't know or speak Greek.
Right.
But the entire New Testament is in Greek.
Right.
Except for maybe one or two books that are written in Aramaic.
Well,
but they're not the Gospels. The Gospels are all in Greek.
Right. Well, I remember hearing this discussed in seminary, that most likely Jesus spoke Aramaic like everybody else. And so even what Jesus is quoted as saying is most likely a translation at best. Okay, so
and they're all written decades after his death. So they're all just recollections.
Right. And that's another thing too. I don't know to what extent, like, even I'd have to maybe talk to some of my friends who are patristics scholars, but I don't know to what extent, like, the church fathers believed that the Gospels were written, those four Gospels were written by those actual apostles, or whether they believed that those books accurately captured the thought of those apostles.
Well, Luke doesn't even claim to be an apostle. Luke is just a doctor or something.
Well, he was believed to be a traveling companion of Paul.
Yeah.
So that's why his, like, apostolicity was one of the key criteria for canonization of the New Testament scriptures. He was believed to have been and of course he wrote the book of Acts. So you throw Luke out, you got to throw Acts out too. So, but he was supposedly a companion of Paul, and Mark was a companion of Peter. And then the other ones who weren't original apostles were James and Jude. They were believed to have been written by James and Jude, the brothers of Jesus.
Right.
So anyway.
Talking about Luke, I find Luke to be a fascinating character in the biblical tradition, and maybe this is off topic too much, but the Gospel of Luke borrows heavily from Matthew and Mark.
Yes.
But it tends to leave out specific things that
Right.
like he'll like skip a sentence
Right.
because it mentions something that only appeals to Jewish
Right.
readers,
Right.
and he'll change things to be more appealing to a Roman audience.
Right. Right.
And then the whole book of Acts is all about how Christianity should be a Roman religion, not a Jewish religion.
Right.
So he has, is the Gospel of Luke maybe motivated by by trying to appeal to a particular audience?
Oh, I think so. I mean, there's
Right.
just like Matthew.
Those are things that make fundamentalists uncomfortable, though.
No, exactly right. I think it makes the text that much more fascinating when you see what the motivation is. It's just like Matthew goes out of his way, like Jesus, King of the Jews. Even the Zoroastrian, the Magi, they're Zoroastrian priests. That's the term it really is what's referring to. They're looking for their Messiah figure who's going to come 1,000 years after
Right.
Zarathustra. And they show up. He's born King of the Jews. And then, of course, that's what they put on the cross. And that's what Pilate asked him, are you King of the Jews? And so this keeps coming up. King of the Jews, King of the Jews, King of the Jews. And the kingdom of God, kingdom of God. And so
in Luke, it's not the Romans who kill Jesus.
Right.
It's the Jews who kill Jesus. And
Yes.
Pilate just kind of,
Right.
are you sure you want to let this happen?
Luke is trying to help transform Christianity into a separate religion and not just to be a Jewish sect anymore. Yeah. And I think that was along the same lines of what Paul was trying to do. And that's why I think he was Paul's traveling companion. They were two that were interested in it being more than just a Jewish sect who was interested in still circumcising baby boys and keeping the Sabbath and doing all that other stuff. So then at the other end of the result of that is Paul tells everybody we're not under law anymore, but grace. Well, then he has to kind of correct people and say, okay, well, liberty in Christ doesn't mean you can do this. It doesn't mean you can do that. Then he's kind of putting out fires because people are like, well, I'm a Christian, so I don't have to obey any of this stuff. So anyway, all right. Well, think we've massaged this enough here for today.
Yeah, and this has maybe been a little bit of a challenging episode for some of our audience, but
yeah, I'm sure it is.
We'll get to a more positive place.
Yes.
I think when we talk about what our relationship with Scripture might look like.
Yeah.
In a non-fundamentalist
So
context.
this first part is more deconstructive, and the second half will be more constructive.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to do. Yeah. So you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. So right now we've got some broken eggs, but we are going to make an omelet. Okay. And we'll help put it together for you. Okay. All right. Well, as always, we welcome your input, your feedback. You want to vent or say how great it was or bad it was or whatever.
Or how misguided we are.
Yeah, sure. Pray for us. We don't end up in hell or purgatory or some other place. But nevertheless, we do have your best interest at heart, and we are trying to just be honest with you and get everybody thinking because these issues are important. We can see how, especially divided societies are becoming and polarized. We have to step up our game of dialogue since we now are communicating at a much more rapid speed. We have to step up our game in learning how to negotiate and work these things out so we're not just getting angered by people all the time.
Right. We have to start resisting the tendency in our faith groups to just insulate us from the broader culture.
Right. Yes, we all enjoy the benefits of the information age, but the responsibility of it is you have to step up your game and process the information, and you have to think about things that may be uncomfortable to think about. But that's the only way to really have peace and long-term happiness. I'm convinced. Well, again, you can get a hold of us at thehappycynics@gmail.com or leave us a comment in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening, getting our broadcast, even on YouTube. We are there. Eventually, we're working our way toward having video as well. We're not quite there yet, but we've got that in our sights. So anyway, we hope you have a great day, and we look forward to spending more time with you very soon.